Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whatever time it is that you are watching this. We are so glad you are here. I'm the Reverend Sheryl Butler, and this is Journey Road Ministries, where we seek to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly. I usually like to preach on the gospel text, but today I would like to consider the lectionary reading from Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 14. After all these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father," and he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for our burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God himself will provide the lamb for our burnt offering, my son." So the 2 of them walked on together. When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But an angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide," as it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." May God bless the reading and the hearing of the word. And this story is somewhat controversial, and I kind of find it to be a terrible story, but there have been many attempts to dismiss or soften a story viewed as morally troubling, where God instructs Abraham in Genesis 22:2, where he says, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you." Now, Richard Dawkins, one of the 4 horsemen of the new atheism, refers to this text as the classic example of theistic child abuse and bullying. And feminist interpreters refer to this as a text of terror. Immanuel Kant in the Enlightenment said the problem with this text is that here Abraham becomes the paradigm. He becomes the indicator of every madman who claims he has heard from God. And he continued, Immanuel Kant said, the problem is that Abraham here has no assurance that he's actually hearing from God. How does he know he is not hearing from a demon? How does he know he is not hearing from some tortured internal voice? How does he know this is the voice of God? And Franz Kafka said, this is just an example of Jewish self-loathing. Kierkegaard called this the temporary suspension of the ethical, saying that this is just a demonstration of the fact that God is above ethics, so that whatever God does is simply a suspension of normal ethical norms. And some more recent liberal biblical scholars have argued it is really nothing more than a warning against child sacrifice. So there are clues in the text itself that there's more going on than meets the eye. And in the beginning of chapter 22, the readers are told that God tested Abraham. And I just find this kind of weird, that God would test Abraham's faith after Abraham had left his home and traveled to some strange land just because God told him to. And in chapter 18, Abraham argues with God to save Sodom. But he accepts sacrificing his son with no challenge. And I wonder what Sarah would have done if God had asked her to sacrifice her only son. I like to believe she would have resisted the idea. And in the Islamic tradition, it is Ishmael who Abraham is told to sacrifice. But maybe this story isn't about Abraham, Isaac, or Ishmael. Maybe it's simply about how mind can change. But what meaning does this have for us today? So today is the 13th Sunday in Ordinary Time, and I like ordinary time. That's when life happens, a time when we experience the blessings for ordinary life. But things haven't seemed very ordinary for a while. As a student of history, I know that troubles have always been present. Natural disasters, political coups, wars, divisiveness, fake news, injustices. But it always seems worse during our own time. Gustave Flaubert, a 19th century French novelist, said, "Our ignorance of history causes us to slander our own times." And I find this to be mostly true. Still, we are living in crazy times. We have a Supreme Court that Frank Schaeffer called disgusting. Schaeffer is a former evangelical filmmaker who created the propaganda films that helped turn evangelicals to anti-abortion. None of the evangelical churches at the time were interested in the film, since most believe that life began at the first breath. Jerry Falwell, however, saw the political value, but he didn't live to see his goal achieved, that the court finally overturned Roe v. Wade last year. Now, don't misunderstand what I am saying. I think abortion is a terrible thing. But I'm not one who believes the "my body, my choice" cry. Personally, I could have had a safe abortion before Roe v. Wade became law, since my father was a doctor and had connections. I chose not to, but many of my friends were not so fortunate. Overturning Roe will not stop abortions. And I get it that there are different beliefs about when life begins. But what is certain is that a pregnant woman is a live soul, and her life matters. Abortion decisions should be made between a man and woman and her doctor, not the state. Wealthy women will always have access to safe abortions, and it is the poor that will suffer. Poor women are being sacrificed because some Christians fail to hear God's voice of change and compassion. And now the court has reversed affirmative action. So white guys have always had preferential treatment for centuries. But they shout unfair when people of color have to be let in. Even with affirmative action, white folks still had an advantage. And I encourage you to check that out if you don't believe that. Again, this is personal to me. I personally benefited from affirmative action. In fact, the group that benefited the most were white women. But I took a lot of crap when I was hired as an engineer in 1980. That I was only hired because of affirmative action. It didn't seem to matter that I graduated top of my class. Of course, prior to affirmative action, I wouldn't even gotten a job interview. Now things have changed some, but people of color, especially the poor, will be the most affected by the reversal. They often don't have the resources or connections to get into the better schools. And the latest, denying student loan relief. I confess this too is personal to me, since I have quite a large student loan. However, the $10,000 would not even put a dent in my loan amount. Seminary, it seems, is immorally expensive. And there are those who have paid their student loans that are angered at the thought of the government helping people who still have loans. They're like the older brother in the story of the prodigal father, where the father celebrates the return of his younger son who had squandered his inheritance. The older brother, who always did the right thing, is pissed that his loser brother is being celebrated. Others object to their tax dollars bailing out people. They forget how the GI Bill was a tremendous investment for the United States. Yes, it cost a lot of money. By 1956, when the original bill expired, $14.5 billion had gone to veterans for education. But for every dollar invested in the GI's higher education, the government and economy received at least $6.90 in return. That was $100 billion return in taxes. Of course, most are unaware that the GI Bill was racially discriminatory, as it was intended to accommodate Jim Crow laws due to the discrimination by local and state governments, as well as by private actors in housing and education. The GI Bill failed to benefit of African Americans as it did with white Americans. Columbia University historian Ira Katzenelson described the GI Bill as affirmative action for whites. Well, it seems that too many people who identify as Christians are not just willing, but joyfully sacrifice women, people of color, the poor on the altar of their bad theology, failing to hear God's voice of change and understand the voice of Jesus when he said, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind." The second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. May it be so. Amen.
Where justice rolls down like a mighty water, and righteousness grows like an ever-flowing stream, and mercy resounds like the waves on the ocean. Let praises rise high on the songs of the redeemed. Where justice rolls down like a mighty water, and righteousness grows like an ever-flowing stream, and mercy resounds like the waves on the ocean. Let praises rise high on the songs of the redeemed. There is a river that streams from the temple, begins as a trickle, but ends in the sea. As it grows, healing it will give. Where it flows, everything will live. Where justice rolls down like a mighty water, and righteousness grows like an ever-flowing stream, and mercy resounds like the waves on the ocean. Let praises rise high on the songs of the redeemed. Wade in the water, feel the strong current. Remember the stagnance of stale life before. God is here. Leave the past behind. In these clear waters you will find. Where justice rolls down like a mighty water, and righteousness grows like an ever-flowing stream, and mercy resounds like the waves on the ocean. Let praises rise high on the songs of the redeemed. Where justice rolls down like a mighty water, and righteousness grows like an ever-flowing stream, and mercy resounds like the waves on the ocean. Let praises rise high